After 30 years riding with the Hells Angels, Jack Steele Morrison thought he'd seen everything life could throw at him. Wrong turns, broken bones, and broken promises were just part of the territory. But at 62, getting fired from the only brotherhood he'd ever known hit harder than any crash he'd survived on the highway. Now he's got nothing but his Harley, a dwindling bank account, and nowhere to call home. The open road that once promised freedom now feels like a dead end, stretching toward nowhere. When his bike breaks down in rural Tennessee, Jack spots something that catches his eye. A forgotten farmhouse, windows boarded up, roof caving in, surrounded by weeds and regret. What he doesn't know is that fixing this broken house will change everything, including himself. But will the small town accept a former outlaw trying to rebuild his life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jack Morrison had been 18 when he first threw his leg over a Harley Davidson and felt the engine's rumble speak directly to his soul. That was 44 years ago, back when his hair was black instead of silver-streaked, when his hands were smooth instead of scarred from countless bar fights and road accidents. The Hells Angels had found him in a dive bar in Oakland, nursing a beer and a black eye from his latest run-in with authority. They offered him something he'd never had before, a family that wouldn't abandon him, a brotherhood that demanded nothing except loyalty and the willingness to ride into hell for your brothers. He'd given them 30 years of his life. 30 years of wearing the colors with pride, of defending the patch with his fists, and sometimes more. He'd run drugs across state lines, collected debts from men who thought they could hide from the angels, and done things that would have sent him to prison for life if the law had ever caught up with him. But times changed. The younger members wanted flash over substance, social media presence over old-school respect. They talked about branding and market presence, like the Angels were some kind of corporation. Instead of an outlaw motorcycle club built on blood and brotherhood, the final straw came during a chapter meeting in Riverside. Jack had questioned a decision to partner with some tech entrepreneur who wanted to use the Angel brand for an energy drink. The kid couldn't have been more than 25, talking about synergy and demographic targeting, while wearing designer jeans that probably cost more than Jack's monthly rent. Maybe it's time for the old guard to step aside, the chapter president had said, not quite meeting Jack's eyes. Let the new generation take the club where it needs to go. The termination letter arrived 3 days later. Formal, typed on club letterhead, like he was being laid off from some office job. 30 years of brotherhood reduced to 2 paragraphs, and a demand to surrender his colors immediately. Jack had stared at that letter for hours, sitting in his 1-bedroom apartment above a tattoo parlor in San Bernardino. The walls were covered with photographs from the road, him and his brothers at rallies in Sturgis, group shots outside dive bars, from Bakersfield to Barstow, faces of men who'd been closer than family until corporate thinking infected the club like a virus. He'd packed everything he owned into a single duffel bag and strapped it to the back of his bike. The 1987 Harley Softail was the only thing he truly owned, bought with his own money and maintained with his own hands. The club couldn't take that away from him. For 3 weeks, he'd ridden east with no destination in mind. He avoided the usual biker haunts, staying away from places where he might run into angels or their rivals. The open road that had once been his sanctuary now felt like exile, each mile taking him further from the only identity he'd ever known. The bike started acting up somewhere outside Memphis. The engine coughed and sputtered, losing power on hills that it should have climbed without effort. Jack pulled into a gas station and spent an hour with his head under the hood. But the problem was deeper than anything he could fix with the basic tools in his kit. He limped the Harley through small towns with names like Whiteville and Bolivar, looking for a motorcycle shop that might have the parts he needed. The countryside rolled past in shades of green and gold. farm fields stretching to horizons that seemed impossibly distant after years of urban riding. That's when he saw the farmhouse. It sat about 200 yards off the main road, connected by a dirt driveway that looked like it hadn't seen traffic in years. The house itself was a study in neglect. White paint peeling from wooden siding, front porch sagging under the weight of a roof that had lost more shingles than it kept. Tall grass and weeds had reclaimed what might once have been a well-tended yard. Something about the place spoke to him. Maybe it was the way the afternoon sun hit the broken windows, or the stubborn oak tree that continued to shade the front yard despite everything falling apart around it. The house looked like he felt, beaten down but not quite broken, forgotten but still standing. His bike died completely just as he turned into the driveway. Jack pushed the Harley up the overgrown driveway, gravel crunching under the wheels and his worn boots. The bike felt heavier than usual, dead weight without the engine's vibration to give it life. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool October air. The front porch groaned under his weight as he climbed the steps. A rusty screen door hung askew on broken hinges, and the main door stood slightly ajar. Jack hesitated before pushing it open, old habits making him cautious about entering someone else's territory uninvited. The smell hit him first. Dust, mildew, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Abandonment had its own scent, he realized. The front room was dim, afternoon light filtering through boards nailed over the windows. Furniture sat covered in white sheets like ghosts of a former life. Jack pulled out his phone to use as a flashlight and began exploring. The kitchen still held dishes in the sink, plates and cups waiting for someone who would never return to wash them. A calendar on the wall showed April 2012, frozen in time. Whoever had lived here had left in a hurry, or maybe just stopped caring about the place. In the living room, he found a mantelpiece lined with family photographs. A young couple on their wedding day, the woman in a simple white dress, the man in his army uniform. Children at various ages playing in what must have been this same yard when it was green and well-tended. An older version of the same couple, standing proudly beside a vegetable garden. Jack studied their faces in the dim light. They looked happy, grounded in a way he'd never been. This had been a home, not just a house. People had built a life here, raised children, celebrated birthdays and anniversaries. Now it was dying by inches, reclaimed by time and neglect. He found the deed in a kitchen drawer, folded inside an old phone book. The property belonged to Robert and Helen Mackenzie, purchased in 1978. Tax records showed payments had stopped in 2012. A sticky note in faded blue ink was attached to the deed, for Tommy, when you're ready to come home. Loved Grandpa Rob. The upstairs held 3 bedrooms, one clearly a child's room, with model airplanes hanging from the ceiling and a train set gathering dust on a plywood table. The master bedroom felt sacred somehow, personal items still arranged on the dresser as if their owners might return at any moment. By the time Jack finished exploring, the sun was setting. He stood on the back porch, looking out over what had once been a substantial garden. Remnants of fence posts marked old boundaries. A few stubborn tomato plants had somehow survived years of neglect, producing small, bitter fruit that no one would harvest. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since morning. The closest town was probably 15 miles back the way he'd come. His bike wasn't going anywhere tonight, and walking that distance in the dark held no appeal. Jack made a decision that surprised him. He would stay here tonight, sleep in this abandoned house like some kind of trespasser. He'd slept in worse places during his years on the road. At least this place had a roof, even if it leaked. He retrieved his sleeping bag from the bike and set up camp in the living room, moving some of the covered furniture to make space. The house settled around him as darkness fell, old wood creaking and expanding. He ate a can of beans cold and washed it down with warm beer from his saddlebags. Lying in his sleeping bag, Jack stared at the ceiling where patches of moonlight leaked through gaps in the roof. This was rock bottom, he realized. 62 years old, fired from the only family he'd ever known, sleeping in a stranger's abandoned house with a broken-down motorcycle and less than $300 to his name. But something about the place felt right, in a way he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the silence after years of engine noise and bar fights. Maybe it was the sense that this house had held real love, real family. Things he'd never quite managed to find in 30 years of brotherhood. Tomorrow, he'd figure out what to do about his bike. Maybe hitch a ride to town and find a mechanic. Tonight, though, he would sleep in a house where people had once been happy, and try to remember what that felt like. Jack woke to sunlight streaming through the broken roof. Dust motes dancing in golden shafts like tiny spirits. His back ached from sleeping on the hardwood floor, but he'd slept better than he had in weeks. The house was quiet, except for the sound of birds outside and the distant hum of traffic from the main road. He made instant coffee with water from a plastic bottle, heating it over a small camping stove he'd pulled from his saddlebags. Standing on the back porch with his steaming cup, Jack surveyed the property in daylight. The yard was bigger than he'd realized, maybe 3 acres of overgrown grass and weeds. The bones of the old garden were still visible, raised beds outlined in rotting timber, a greenhouse with most of its glass panels broken. Something about the neglect bothered him more than it should have. This place had been loved once. Someone had put care into every detail, from the hand-built garden beds to the stone pathway that led from the house to what looked like a tool shed. In the shed, Jack found treasure, a collection of hand tools that had been properly stored and oiled before abandonment. Hammers, saws, chisels, and levels, all bearing the patina of regular use. A workbench ran along one wall, scarred by decades of projects. Someone had been handy here, had taken pride in building and fixing things. Jack picked up a claw hammer, testing its weight. The handle was worn smooth by countless hands, shaped by years of honest work. He hadn't done construction since his early 20s, before the angels found him. But muscle memory was a strange thing. His hands remembered the feel of tools, the satisfaction of building something useful. The broken window in the kitchen nagged at him. Just a small thing really, but it let in rain and cold air. Jack found a piece of plywood in the shed and some nails. Within an hour, he'd made a temporary patch that would keep the weather out until he could find proper glass. One repair led to another. The front porch railing had a loose board that would be dangerous if someone leaned on it. Easy enough to tighten the screws. The gutters were clogged with years of leaves and debris. Jack climbed up with a ladder from the shed and cleared them out, remembering how his grandfather had taught him to clean gutters as a boy. By mid-afternoon, he'd made a list of everything that needed fixing. It was a long list. The roof needed new shingles. Several windows were broken or had frames that were rotting. The front steps were pulling away from the foundation. The plumbing probably didn't work, and he hadn't even looked at the electrical system. His stomach reminded him he needed food, and his bike still needed attention. Jack walked the 2 miles to the main road and caught a ride with a farmer driving an old pickup truck. "You're staying out at the Mackenzie place?" the farmer asked, giving Jack a curious look. The man was probably 60, with weathered hands and suspicious eyes. "Just temporarily. My bike broke down. Shame about that house." Rob Mackenzie was a good man. Worked that land for 30 years before his grandson got himself killed in Afghanistan. After that, Rob just lost heart. Helen had already passed, and Tommy was all they had left. Jack filed away this information. The note on the deed made more sense now. The farmer dropped him at a crossroads where a small general store sat next to a gas station. Inside, Jack bought supplies, canned food, coffee, batteries for his flashlight. The woman behind the counter was maybe 50, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "You're new around here," she said, not quite making it a question. "Just passing through. Had some mechanical trouble. Mary Ellen Patterson," she said, extending her hand. "I own this place with my husband. Anything you need, we can probably order it, if we don't have it in stock." Jack shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of hard work. "Jack Morrison, I appreciate the hospitality. You staying somewhere in town?" Jack hesitated. Something about Mary Ellen made him want to be honest. "Actually, I'm camping out at the old Mackenzie place. My motorcycle died in their driveway." Mary Ellen's expression softened. "That poor house. It's been sitting empty for 3 years now. Rob would be heartbroken to see how it's deteriorated. Did you know the family well? Rob and Helen were like family to everyone in this valley. When their grandson died, it broke something in Rob. He held on for about a year after that, then just packed up one day and moved to assisted living in Nashville. Said he couldn't bear to stay where everything reminded him of Tommy. Walking back to the house as evening approached, Jack carried more than just groceries. He carried the weight of other people's grief, the knowledge that this place had seen both joy and devastating loss. Maybe that's why it felt familiar to him. He understood loss, understood what it meant to have your whole world stripped away in an instant. Jack's third week at the farmhouse began with a ritual that had become as natural as breathing. He woke before dawn, made coffee on his camping stove, and stood on the back porch, watching the sun paint the Tennessee hills in shades of amber and gold. The air was crisp now, carrying the promise of winter, and he could see his breath as he planned the day's work. The roof had become his primary focus. He'd found a stash of asphalt shingles in the shed, left over from some project Rob Mackenzie had never finished. They were weathered but still serviceable. Each morning, Jack climbed the ladder with his tool belt and worked methodically across the damaged sections, replacing missing shingles and sealing gaps that had let rain into the house for years. The work was meditative in a way he hadn't expected. After decades of living by the club's schedule, riding when they rode, fighting when they fought, the simple rhythm of hammer against nail felt like meditation. His hands remembered skills from his youth, when he'd worked construction crews during hot Oklahoma summers, saving money and dreaming of escape. Mary Ellen had started making regular trips to check on him, bringing supplies and staying to chat over coffee. She never asked directly about his past, but Jack sensed her curiosity. She was too polite to pry, raised in a generation that understood privacy, but her eyes held questions. "You're making real progress," she said one afternoon, surveying the new shingles that covered nearly half the roof. Rob would be pleased to see someone caring for his place again. Jack climbed down from the ladder, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool weather. "Found something interesting in the shed yesterday. Packets of seeds stored in glass jars, tomatoes, beans, corn. Some are dated 2011, but seeds can last years if they're kept dry." Mary Ellen's face lit up. Helen's garden was legendary in this valley. She grew enough vegetables to feed half the county and gave most of it away. Always said good soil was meant to be shared. Think any of those seeds might still be viable? Only one way to find out. Spring's still months away, but you could start some indoors. Helen had a little greenhouse behind the main garden. Jack had noticed the greenhouse, its frame intact, but most of the glass panels broken or missing. Another project for the ever-growing list. But the idea of planting something, of coaxing life from Helen's old seeds, appealed to him in ways he couldn't fully explain. That evening, he was replacing a broken board on the front steps when he noticed he wasn't alone. A teenager sat on a bicycle at the end of the driveway watching him work. The kid was maybe 16, thin and nervous-looking, with dark hair that needed cutting. Jack pretended not to notice for a while, continuing his work with the measured movements of someone who wasn't in a hurry. Finally, he looked up and nodded. Evening. The kid startled, as if he'd been caught doing something wrong. For a moment, Jack thought he might pedal away. Instead, he walked his bike closer. "You're the guy who's been fixing up this place. Seems like word travels fast in a small town." "I'm Tommy Mackenzie." Jack set down his hammer, understanding flooding through him. This was the boy mentioned in the note on the deed, Rob's grandson. But the timeline didn't make sense. The farmer had said Tommy died in Afghanistan. Reading his confusion, the boy clarified, "I'm the other Tommy, Tommy Jr. My dad was the one who died over there. This was my great-grandfather's place." Jack studied the boy's face, seeing resemblances to the family photos inside the house. The same stubborn chin, the same intelligent eyes. But where the earlier generations had looked confident and grounded, this Tommy seemed lost, adrift in ways Jack recognized. "I heard about your father." "I'm sorry for your loss," Tommy shrugged, with the false casualness of someone who'd learned to deflect sympathy. "It was a long time ago. I was just a kid. How old are you now? 16. Dad died when I was 13. Mum moved us to town after that, said the farm was too far from everything. Jack picked up his hammer again, driving another nail with precise strikes. Your great-grandfather left quite a place here. Good bones, solid construction, built to last. He taught me some carpentry when I was little. Before everything went to hell, there was pain in the boy's voice, the particular ache of someone who'd lost not just people, but a way of life, a sense of belonging. Jack recognized it because he carried the same wound. You're welcome to stay and watch if you want. Might even put you to work if you're not careful. For the first time, Tommy smiled. It transformed his entire face, revealing the confident Mackenzie genetics beneath the uncertainty. I've got time. Tommy became a regular presence at the farmhouse, showing up after school with his bicycle and staying until dark. The boy had good hands for the work, patient and careful in ways that reminded Jack of master craftsmen. He'd known, together, they tackled projects that would have taken Jack twice as long working alone. It was Tommy who found the newspaper clipping. They were cleaning out the master bedroom, boxing up personal items that had been left behind when Rob Mackenzie moved to assisted living. Jack had been careful with these things, treating them like artifacts from someone else's life. Photo albums, jewelry boxes, letters tied with ribbon, all the intimate debris of a long marriage. Tommy was going through the nightstand when he froze, his face going pale. "What is it?" Jack asked, looking up from a box of old books. Tommy held up a yellowed newspaper clipping, his hands shaking slightly. "This is from the Nashville paper. July 15th, 2009. Jack took the clipping and read the headline. Local family killed in highway accident. Below it was a photograph of a twisted car wreck and a smaller photo of 3 people. A young man in military fatigues, a woman about 30, and a little girl with pigtails. Staff Sergeant Robert Mackenzie, Jr., 28, was killed along with his wife Jennifer, 30, and daughter Sarah, 6, when their vehicle was struck by a drunk driver on Interstate 40 last Sunday evening. The family was returning from a visit to Mackenzie's grandparents in Wilson County when the accident occurred. Jack read the article twice, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. This wasn't about Tommy's father dying in Afghanistan. This was something else entirely, something that had torn the Mackenzie family apart years before any deployment. "I don't understand," Jack said quietly. "I thought your father died in the war." Tommy's composure cracked. Tears ran down his cheeks as he stared at the clipping. "He did, but that's my Uncle Bobby, my dad's brother. And Jennifer was my aunt, and Sarah was my cousin. They all died when I was 9. The boy sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the weight of family tragedy settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Great-grandpa Rob never got over it. He blamed himself because he'd invited them for Sunday dinner. Said if he hadn't asked them to come, they'd still be alive. After that, he just started giving up on everything. The farm, the house, even himself. Jack felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Where does that leave you and your father?" Dad couldn't handle being here after the accident. Too many memories, too much guilt. He joined the army 6 months later, said he needed to get away from everything that reminded him of what we'd lost. He was supposed to come back after his first deployment, but he kept re-enlisting. Then Afghanistan happened. The full weight of the Mackenzie family's loss hit Jack like a physical blow. Not just one death, but a cascade of them. 3 family members killed in an instant. A father so destroyed by grief that he abandoned his own son. A young man who died half a world away while running from ghosts he couldn't escape. Your great-grandfather wrote that note on the deed for your father, didn't he? Not for you, Tommy nodded, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. Dad never came home. After he died, Great-grandpa tried to keep going for my sake, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. He moved to Nashville when I was 13, and Mom took me to live in town with her new boyfriend. What about this place? Legally, I mean, it goes to me when I turn 18. Great-grandpa set up some kind of trust. But Mom says I should just sell it, use the money for college. She thinks this place is cursed. Jack walked to the window, looking out over the land that had witnessed so much joy and sorrow. The afternoon sun slanted across the overgrown garden. highlighting the stubborn tomato plants that continued to produce fruit no one would harvest. Maybe your mother's right about selling. No. Tommy's voice was fierce, surprising in its intensity. This is my family's land. 4 generations of Mackenzies lived here, worked this soil, raised their children in these rooms. I'm not going to be the one who lets it all disappear. Jack turned back to the boy, seeing something new in his face. Determination, maybe, or the first stirrings of the kind of strength that had built this place in the first place. Then we'd better make sure it's worth keeping. Tommy smiled through his tears, and for a moment Jack saw the echo of all the Mackenzies, who had called this place home. The Wilson County Commission meeting was held in a stuffy room above the courthouse that smelled of old coffee and decades of political maneuvering. Folding chairs arranged in neat rows faced a long table where 5 commissioners sat like judges, their faces ranging from bored to hostile. Jack had never been comfortable in rooms like this. Throughout his years with the Angels, he'd learned to navigate bars, back alleys, and highway truck stops, but bureaucracy was foreign territory. He wore his cleanest jeans and a button-down shirt Tommy had helped him pick out, feeling like he was wearing a costume. The room was more crowded than he'd expected. Dorothy Clemens sat in the front row with Pastor Williams, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who'd spent the past week helping Jack research the historical significance of the Mackenzie property. Mary Ellen was there with her husband, along with a dozen other faces Jack recognized from around town. Commissioner Bradley, a heavy-set man with the demeanor of someone used to getting his way, called the meeting to order with little ceremony. First item on the agenda is the petition regarding the Mackenzie property condemnation. Mr. He consulted his papers with obvious irritation. Mr. Morrison, you have 5 minutes to present your case. Jack stood, his mouth dry despite the coffee he'd consumed that morning. He'd practiced this speech with Tommy and Pastor Williams, but facing the commissioners felt like standing before a hostile jury. Thank you. My name is Jack Morrison, and for the past 2 months, I've been living at and restoring the Mackenzie farmhouse on Old County Road, 12. I'm here to request that you reconsider the condemnation. Order, Commissioner Bradley interrupted. Before Jack could continue, Mr. Morrison, are you the legal owner of this property? No, sir, but I'm speaking on behalf of Tommy Mackenzie, the heir to the property, who's a minor. Where is young Mr. Mackenzie? He's here. Jack gestured to Tommy, who stood nervously beside Mary Ellen. But I thought it would be appropriate for an adult to present the formal petition, Commissioner. Bradley's expression suggested he found nothing appropriate about the situation. And what exactly is your relationship to this family, Mr. Morrison? Jack felt the weight of the room's attention. This was the moment he'd been dreading, when his past would either help or destroy any chance of saving the house. I'm a friend. Someone who believes this property has value beyond what shows up on a tax assessment. What kind of value? Commissioner Bradley's tone made it clear he considered this a waste of time. Jack had prepared for this question, but the prepared words suddenly seemed inadequate. Instead, he found himself speaking from the heart, the value of continuity, of remembering that families like the Mackenzies built this county, worked this land, served in our wars, and contributed to the community for generations. That house has sheltered 4 generations of good people, and it deserves better than being bulldozed for a highway that half the county doesn't want. A murmur ran through the crowd. Commissioner Bradley banged his gavel once. Mr. Morrison, this commission deals in legal and financial realities, not sentimentality. The property taxes are in arrears, the structure has been condemned as unsafe, and the highway expansion has been approved by the state. Unless you can produce the $15,000 in back taxes, this discussion is academic. Jack felt his prepared speech crumbling. He looked back at Tommy, seeing the boy's face fall as the harsh reality of bureaucracy crushed their hopes. That's when Mary Ellen stood up. Commissioner Bradley, I'd like to address the commission. Ma'am, this isn't a public forum. Mr. Morrison has the floor. Actually, Pastor Williams said, rising beside her. "I believe Mrs. Patterson has every right to speak as a concerned citizen about county business." Mary Ellen didn't wait for permission. "My family has lived in this county for 4 generations. My great-grandfather homesteaded here in 1889. I've watched this community grow and change, mostly for the better. But I've also watched us lose things that matter." She paused, looking directly at Commissioner Bradley. "When we tear down the Mackenzie house, we're not just removing a building. We're erasing a piece of our history. And for what? A highway that will bring noise and pollution and turn our rural roads into shortcuts for truck traffic." Other voices joined hers. Dorothy Clemens spoke about the historical significance of the property. Pastor Williams presented research showing the house qualified for the National Register of Historic Places. A farmer named Henderson complained about the highway's impact on agricultural operations. Commissioner Bradley tried to maintain order, but the room had found its voice. Person after person stood to defend not just the house, but the idea that some things were worth preserving even when preservation was inconvenient. Finally, Tommy himself stood up. His voice was quiet but clear in the suddenly silent room. "My great-grandfather loved this land. My father died defending this country. My family gave everything they had to this community. And now you want to erase the last piece of them for a road nobody asked for." He looked around the room, making eye contact with each commissioner. "Jack Morrison has done more for my family's property in 2 months than anyone else has. Done in 3 years. Maybe it's time this county started taking care of people who take care of us." 1 year later, Jack stood on the same back porch where he'd first watched the sunrise over the Tennessee hills, but everything had changed. The coffee in his hands was brewed in a proper kitchen with running water and electricity. The roof over his head was solid, sealed against the weather with new shingles and careful craftsmanship. The garden beyond the porch showed the first green shoots of spring vegetables, planted from seeds that had waited years for someone to give them purpose. The county commission had voted 3-2 to delay the condemnation, giving Jack and Tommy 6 months to bring the property up to code and clear the tax debt. What followed was something Jack had never experienced in 30 years with the Hells Angels, a community mobilizing to help one of its own. Mary Ellen organized a fundraising drive that raised $8,000 in 3 weeks. Pastor Williams connected them with a historical preservation grant that covered another $4,000. Local contractors donated labor and materials. Even Commissioner Bradley, faced with overwhelming community pressure, had quietly arranged for the county to waive penalty fees. Tommy had thrown himself into the restoration work with the passion of someone reclaiming his heritage. After school and weekends, he learned plumbing and electrical work, mastered the art of hanging drywall, and developed the patient eye needed for finish carpentry. Jack watched the boy transform from a lost teenager into a young man with purpose and skills. The house itself had been reborn. What had been a monument to abandonment was now a home again. Jack had moved into the small bedroom that had once belonged to Tommy's father, while keeping the master bedroom as a shrine to Rob and Helen Mackenzie. Their photographs still lined the mantelpiece, but now they were surrounded by evidence of new life, fresh flowers from the garden, books being read rather than gathering dust, the smell of actual cooking instead of decay. Tommy's mother had been the biggest surprise. Sarah Mackenzie, worn down by years of struggle and disappointment, had initially opposed her son's involvement with some stranger living in a condemned house. But as the restoration progressed and the community rallied around the project, she began to see what Jack saw, her son becoming the man his father and great-grandfather would have been proud of. "I still think you're both crazy," she said, standing in the renovated kitchen on a warm April evening. But I can't argue with the results. She was referring to more than just the house. Tommy's grades had improved dramatically. He'd found part-time work with a local contractor who was teaching him advanced carpentry skills. Most importantly, he'd found his footing, discovered who he was beyond the tragedy that had shaped his early years. Jack had found something too, though it had taken him months to put a name to it. Belonging, maybe, or purpose. For the first time since his teenage years, he woke up each morning knowing exactly why he was alive and what he needed to do. The Hells Angels felt like a lifetime ago. Sometimes he wondered what his old brothers would think of him now. The feared enforcer who'd become a small-town handyman. The outlaw who'd learned to navigate historical preservation committees and building permits. But those thoughts came less frequently as the months passed. Mary Ellen had become more than a friend, though they were both too careful to rush into anything serious. They shared coffee most mornings, worked side by side in the garden most evenings, and talked about everything except the future they might build together, you know. She said one evening, as they sat on the front porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, Rob Mackenzie used to say this land had a way of healing broken things. Broken people, broken families, broken hearts. Jack looked out over the property that had become his home. The barn was next on his list, a project that would take most of the summer. Tommy was planning to spend his senior year living in the house, commuting to school from the land his family had worked for generations. Maybe Rob was right, Jack said, feeling the weight of the brass house key in his pocket. It was more than just a key to a front door. It was proof that sometimes, when everything falls apart, you can find something better in the wreckage. The cicadas began their evening song, and Jack Morrison, former Hells Angel and current caretaker of the Mackenzie legacy, settled back in his chair to listen to the sound of home. 5 years had passed since Jack Morrison first pushed his broken Harley up the gravel driveway of the Mackenzie farmhouse. The motorcycle now sat in the restored barn, polished and maintained, but rarely ridden. Jack preferred his pickup truck these days, a practical vehicle better suited for hauling lumber and garden supplies than making statements about freedom and rebellion. Tommy was 21 now, a junior at Middle Tennessee State University studying agricultural engineering. He came home most weekends, bringing textbooks and theories about sustainable farming that he was eager to test on the family land. The boy had grown into himself, confident in ways that reminded Jack of the Mackenzie men in the old photographs. The farmhouse had become something of a local landmark. Tour groups from the Historical Society stopped by occasionally, drawn by the story of its near demolition and dramatic rescue. Jack tolerated these visits with good humor, though he never mentioned his own past beyond saying he was between jobs when he'd found the place. Mary Ellen had moved in the previous spring, a gradual transition that felt as natural as the changing seasons. Her presence filled corners of the house that Jack hadn't realized were empty. She brought her own furniture and photographs, blending her history with the Mackenzie legacy in ways that honored both families. The garden had become Mary Ellen's domain, though Jack still helped with the heavy work. Where Helen Mackenzie had grown vegetables for the community, Mary Ellen focused on herbs and flowers, selling arrangements at the farmers market and supplying restaurants in Nashville with fresh basil and rosemary. Jack found himself thinking about legacy more often these days. He'd spent 30 years with the Hells Angels, believing that brotherhood was about loyalty to the club, about maintaining reputation through intimidation and violence. But watching Tommy grow into manhood had taught him different lessons about what it meant to leave something meaningful behind. The young man was dating a girl from his engineering program, a smart woman named Lisa who understood the importance of the land and didn't try to talk Tommy into selling it for development money. Jack suspected there would be a wedding within a year or two, and the prospect of children running through these rooms again filled him with quiet satisfaction. On quiet evenings, Jack sometimes walked through the house and marveled at the transformation. The kitchen, where he'd first made instant coffee on a camping stove, now featured modern appliances and a farmhouse table where the family gathered for Sunday dinners. The living room, that had been filled with sheet-covered furniture, was now warm and lived in, with books on the shelves and photographs on the mantel that included Jack and Mary Ellen, alongside the Mackenzie family portraits. The bedroom that had been his refuge for the first year was now a guest room, painted and furnished for Tommy's visits home from college. Jack and Mary Ellen shared the master bedroom, a decision that had taken them both months to make and felt right in ways neither of them had expected. Sometimes former Hell's Angels would track him down, curious about what had happened to Steele Morrison. Jack always met them at the local diner rather than bringing them to the house, protective of the life he'd built. Most were surprised by what they found. A man at peace with himself, settled in ways that contradicted everything they thought they knew about their former brother. "You don't miss the road?" one had asked recently, a younger angel passing through on his way to a rally in Georgia. Jack had considered the question seriously before answering. "I found something better than the road. I found home." The concept was foreign to most of his former brothers, men who equated movement with freedom and settling down with surrender. But Jack had learned the difference between running toward something and running away from everything. For the first time in his adult life, he was building rather than destroying, creating rather than consuming. As autumn painted the Tennessee hills in shades of gold and crimson, Jack Morrison stood on his front porch with a cup of coffee and watched the sunrise paint the sky. Mary Ellen was still sleeping upstairs. Tommy would be home Friday evening with laundry and stories from college. The garden was ready for winter. The house was solid against the coming cold. And Jack had work to do on the barn's south wall. It was, he realized, exactly the life he'd never known he wanted. The white tent looked impossibly elegant against the backdrop of the Tennessee hills, its canvas walls billowing gently in the October breeze. Jack stood at the edge of the crowd, adjusting his tie for the third time in 10 minutes. He'd worn suits before, mostly to court appearances and funerals, but never to anything as joyful as Tommy's wedding. Lisa was beautiful in the way that college-educated women often were, confident, articulate, and clearly devoted to the young man she was about to marry. Her family had driven down from Kentucky, city people who'd been politely puzzled by the rural setting until they saw what Tommy and Jack had built together. The farmhouse gleamed in the afternoon sun, every board and shingle a testament to patient craftsmanship. Mary Ellen moved through the crowd with the easy grace of someone who'd organized church socials and community events for decades. She wore a blue dress that brought out her eyes and made Jack remember why he'd fallen in love with her steady competence as much as her kindness. "You clean up pretty well for an old biker," she said, straightening his collar with the familiarity of 5 years together. "Don't get used to it. This monkey suit goes back to the rental place tomorrow." Tommy appeared at Jack's elbow, looking nervous and handsome in his black tuxedo. "Jack, I need to ask you something." "What's that, son?" The word had slipped out naturally, as it had more frequently over the past year. Tommy had never corrected him, and Jack had stopped apologizing for the presumption. "Lisa's father is walking her down the aisle, obviously, but I was wondering if you'd stand with me." "As my best man?" Jack felt something tighten in his chest. "What about your friends from college?" "They're great guys, but they didn't teach me how to use a hammer or show me that work could be something more than just a paycheck." "You're the closest thing to a father I've had since I was 13. The words hung between them, loaded with 5 years of shared labor and gradual trust. Jack had been a lot of things in his 67 years. Enforcer, criminal, drifter, and finally, something approaching a decent man. But he'd never been anyone's father figure. I'd be honored. The ceremony was simple and beautiful. Pastor Williams, now fully gray, but still possessed of a gentle authority, spoke about love as a choice made daily, rather than a feeling that came and went. Jack found himself thinking about Mary Ellen, about the way she'd chosen to build a life with a man whose past she knew only in fragments. Tommy's vows were heartfelt and practical, promising to love Lisa through good harvests and bad, through student loans and mortgage payments, through all the mundane challenges that would test their commitment more thoroughly than any grand romantic gesture. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Jack applauded with the rest of the crowd, but his eyes were on the farmhouse that had made this moment possible. Without the house to restore, Tommy might have remained a lost teenager. Without Tommy's need for guidance, Jack might never have learned that he had something worthwhile to offer another human being. The reception lasted until well after sunset. Jack danced with Mary Ellen to songs he didn't recognize, feeling slightly ridiculous, but grateful for the excuse to hold her close. He shook hands with Lisa's father, a banker from Louisville, who'd been skeptical of his daughter marrying a farm boy until he saw the quality of the life Tommy was offering. Late in the evening, as the younger guests continued to dance and the older ones gathered around tables sharing stories, Tommy found Jack sitting on the front porch steps. "Thank you," Tommy said, settling beside him with 2 bottles of beer. "For what?" "For staying. For teaching me that fixing broken things was possible. For showing me that family doesn't always come from blood." Jack accepted the beer and took a long pull. "You taught me a few things too." "Like what?" "Like the difference between being needed and being wanted. The angels needed me because I was useful, good at solving problems with my fists. But you and Mary Ellen and this community, you wanted me around even after you found out who I used to be." Tommy was quiet for a moment, processing this distinction. "You know what Great-Grandpa Rob used to tell me? He said home wasn't a place. It was people who chose to love you on your worst days." Jack nodded, understanding completely. He'd spent 30 years searching for that kind of belonging in motorcycle clubs and dive bars, never realizing it would find him in a broken-down farmhouse when he'd stopped looking for it entirely. Inside the tent, the band played something slow and sweet. Mary Ellen appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light. "You two going to sit out here all night, or are you going to come dance with your family?" Jack stood, offering his arm to the woman who'd taught him that it was never too late to choose a different kind of life, the young man pushing. The broken motorcycle up the driveway looked exactly like Jack had 7 years ago. Desperate, weathered, and carrying the particular weight of someone who'd lost everything that mattered. Jack watched from the kitchen window as the stranger struggled with a Harley that had clearly seen better days. Mary Ellen joined him at the window, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Looks familiar." Too familiar. Jack set down his coffee cup and headed for the front door. The stranger was maybe 40, with the lean build and careful eyes of someone who'd learned to watch for trouble. His leather jacket bore no colors, but Jack recognized the stance, the way he held himself apart from the world. This was a man between lives, caught in the dangerous space where old identities had died, but new ones hadn't been born yet. "Engine trouble?" Jack called out as he approached. The man looked up, assessing Jack with the quick evaluation of someone who'd spent years determining whether strangers represented opportunity or threat. "Yeah, started making noise about 20 miles back, then just died. I'm Jack Morrison. This is my place. Sorry, man. I saw the driveway and thought maybe I could get off the main road, figure out what's wrong without blocking traffic." Jack studied the motorcycle, recognizing the symptoms of a blown head gasket. "What's your name?" "Danny. Danny Reeves." "Well, Danny, that bike's not going anywhere today. Probably not this week. You got somewhere to be?" Danny's laugh held no humor. "Not really. Was just riding, seeing where the road took me." Jack nodded, understanding the aimlessness that came with having no destination. "You hungry?" Danny hesitated, clearly suspicious of unexpected kindness. "I don't have much money." "Didn't ask about money. Asked if you were hungry." Inside the farmhouse, Mary Ellen had already set an extra place at the kitchen table. She'd lived with Jack long enough to recognize the signs. Another lost soul, drawn to the place where broken things got fixed. Danny ate with the careful manners of someone who'd learned not to take food for granted. He answered Jack's questions with the minimum information necessary, revealing little beyond his name and the fact that he'd been riding east from somewhere in New Mexico. "You former military?" Jack asked, recognizing something in Danny's bearing. "Marines. 2 tours in Afghanistan before everything went to hell stateside." "What kind of hell?" Danny shrugged. "Wife left, took the kids. Lost my job when the plant closed. Spent 6 months drinking myself stupid before I figured out that wasn't solving anything. Jack refilled Danny's coffee cup, remembering his own journey from the angels to this kitchen table. So you decided to ride it off, something like that. Figured maybe if I kept moving, I'd eventually find somewhere that felt right. Mary Ellen spoke for the first time since Danny had entered the house. Sometimes what feels right finds you instead. After lunch, Jack showed Danny to the guest bedroom that had once been his own refuge. You can stay here while we figure out your bike situation. There's a shower down the hall, clean towels in the closet. I can't pay you, didn't ask you to. But if you're going to be here a few days, you might as well make yourself useful. I've got a barn roof that needs attention, and these old bones don't climb ladders like they used to. Danny's suspicion was gradually replaced by something that might have been relief. Why are you doing this? Jack considered the question, remembering asking Mary Ellen something similar years ago. Because someone did it for me once. Because this house has a way of attracting people who need fixing. And I've learned that fixing people is more satisfying than I expected. That evening, Jack found Danny on the front porch, staring out at the hills as darkness settled over the valley. The younger man held a beer but hadn't opened it. Peaceful here, Danny said. It is now. Wasn't always. Jack settled into the chair beside him. This place was falling apart when I found it. Roof leaking, windows broken, everything overgrown and neglected. What happened to it? Same thing that happens to most places. People stopped caring for it, lost the people who made it home, and without them, it just started dying. Danny opened his beer and took a careful sip. How'd you bring it back? One board at a time, one window at a time, one day at a time. Turns out fixing things is mostly about showing up consistently and doing the work, even when you don't feel like it. They sat in comfortable silence, watching fireflies begin their evening dance in the grass. Jack thought about Tommy and Lisa, probably settling into their new apartment near the university. About Mary Ellen inside, reading in the living room where he'd once slept on the floor. About all the small decisions and daily acts of care that had transformed this place from ruins into home. The bike's probably fixable, Jack said eventually. Might take a week or two to get parts, but it's not beyond saving. Danny nodded, understanding that they weren't just talking about motorcycles anymore. Danny's story came out in fragments over the following days, revealed through conversations while they worked side by side on the barn roof. Unlike Jack, who had guarded his past like a secret, Danny seemed almost eager to share the weight of his failures with someone who wouldn't judge them. He'd grown. Up in a small town outside Albuquerque, the son of a mechanic who taught him to work with his hands before the military taught him to work with weapons. 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat engineer, defusing roadside bombs and building forward operating bases in hostile territory. He'd been good at it, the kind of soldier who thrived on dangerous work and clear objectives. Problem with war, Danny said, carefully positioning a new shingle, is that it gives your life structure. Wake up, mission briefing, execute, debrief. Everything has a purpose, even when that purpose is terrible. Jack understood the appeal of structure, having found it first in the Hells Angels and later in the daily rhythm of farmhouse repairs. What happened when you came back? Nothing happened. That was the problem. No missions, no clear objectives, just civilian life stretching out like a highway to nowhere. Danny had married his high school girlfriend 2 weeks after his first deployment, convinced that love and good intentions would be enough to bridge the gap between who he'd been and who the military had made him. Jessica had tried to understand, but understanding required sharing experiences that couldn't be translated into civilian language. She used to ask me what Afghanistan was like, Danny said, his hammer pausing mid-swing. How do you explain watching your buddy step on an IED? How do you describe the smell of burning diesel and blood? How do you tell someone you love that some part of you misses the clarity of knowing exactly who the enemy was? The marriage had lasted 3 years and produced 2 children before Jessica finally admitted that she was married to a stranger. Danny had tried to change, to become the man she'd thought she was marrying. But the effort of constant translation between his inner and outer worlds had exhausted them both. The divorce was almost a relief, Danny admitted. At least then I could stop pretending to be someone I wasn't. The job at the aircraft parts factory had been good work, steady pay assembling components for commercial jets. Danny found satisfaction in precision manufacturing, the way individual parts came together to create something larger and more complex. But when the plant closed and moved operations to Mexico, he joined the ranks of skilled workers with obsolete skills. 6 months of unemployment benefits, then nothing. I started drinking more, sleeping less, picking fights with people who looked at me wrong. One morning I woke up on my bathroom floor with blood on my knuckles and no memory of how it got there. That was when Danny had bought the Harley, a decision that made no financial sense but felt emotionally necessary. If he was going to lose everything anyway, at least he could choose how to lose it. I told myself I was looking for work, following leads in other states. But really, I was just running. Easier to be a drifter than to face the fact that I'd failed at everything that was supposed to matter. Jack listened, without offering advice or empty reassurances. He'd learned that men like Danny didn't need sympathy as much as they needed someone to witness their story without trying to fix it. The work itself was therapeutic, the repetitive motion of hammering shingles, providing a rhythm that allowed difficult truths to emerge. By the end of the week, they'd finished the barn roof and moved on to repairing fence posts in the back pasture. Danny worked with the methodical competence of someone who understood tools and materials. But Jack could see the younger man struggling with larger questions about purpose and direction. What happens when the bike's fixed? Jack asked one afternoon as they reset a gatepost that had been leaning for years. I don't know. Keep riding, I guess. See what's down the road. What if what you're looking for isn't down the road? What if it's something you have to build where you are? Danny paused in his digging, considering the question. I've tried building before. Wife, house, job, all the things you're supposed to want. Didn't work out so well. Maybe you were building the wrong things. Or building them for the wrong reasons. Jack gestured toward the farmhouse, visible through the trees. When I started working on that place, I wasn't trying to build a new life. I was just trying to fix what was broken, one small repair at a time. Somewhere along the way, fixing the house started fixing me. Danny leaned on his shovel, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool October air. You really think it's that simple? Simple doesn't mean easy. But yeah, I think sometimes the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in work that matters. The motorcycle parts arrived on a Thursday, shipped from a salvage yard in Memphis. Danny had been at the farmhouse for 2 weeks by then, long enough for the town to notice and begin forming opinions about Jack's latest project. Mary Ellen brought news from the general store, where conversations tended to reflect the community's collective mood. Folks are curious about your friend, she said over breakfast, watching Danny through the window as he organized tools in the barn. Dorothy Clemens asked if he was planning to stay permanently. Jack buttered his toast with deliberate care. What did you tell her? That it wasn't my decision to make. But people remember how things went with you, and they're wondering if lightning strikes twice in the same place. The comparison wasn't lost on Jack. 7 years ago, he'd been the mysterious stranger working on the Mackenzie place, subject to the same speculation and cautious acceptance that Danny was experiencing now. The difference was that Jack now understood both sides of the equation. Maybe we should introduce him around properly. Let people meet him instead of just talking about him. Mary Ellen smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. Pastor Williams mentioned that the church is organizing a community work day this Saturday, cleaning up the cemetery before winter, repairing some of the older headstones. Might be a good opportunity for Danny to show what kind of man he is. Jack found Danny in the barn, studying the motorcycle engine with the focused attention of someone who understood mechanical systems. The Harley was partially disassembled, its components arranged on a clean tarp with military precision. How's it looking? Jack asked. Better than I expected. The head gasket's shot, like you thought, but the cylinders are in good shape. Should be running again by this weekend. Jack leaned against the workbench, watching Danny work. The younger man had found his rhythm over the past 2 weeks. falling into the kind of productive routine that Jack remembered from his own early days at the farmhouse. "There's a community work day this Saturday at the Methodist Cemetery. Wondered if you might want to help out before you hit the road again." Danny looked up from the engine, grease on his hands and a question in his eyes. "You think that's a good idea?" "I'm not exactly the church type." Neither was I. "But this town has a way of judging people by their actions more than their history. Might be worth showing them who you are when you're not running from something." Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn light that made even mundane tasks feel significant. The Methodist cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the valley, its weathered headstones telling the story of families who'd lived and died in this small corner of Tennessee for over a century. Danny arrived with Jack and Mary Ellen, carrying a toolbox and wearing clothes appropriate for physical labor. Jack introduced him to Pastor Williams and the dozen other volunteers who'd gathered for the workday, describing him simply as a friend who's been helping with projects around the farm. The work was satisfying in its straightforwardness, clearing weeds from around old graves, resetting headstones that had shifted over time, repairing the low stone wall that bordered the cemetery. Danny gravitated toward the technical challenges, using his engineering background to figure out how to stabilize monuments that had been leaning for decades. Pastor Williams worked beside him for most of the morning, the two men developing an easy conversation about leverage and foundation work. Jack watched from across the cemetery as Danny explained his approach to a particularly challenging repair, his natural teaching ability emerging as he showed younger volunteers how to use simple tools to achieve complex results. "Your friend knows what he's doing," Dorothy Clemens observed, appearing at Jack's elbow with a thermos of coffee. "Military training, I'd guess. Marines. Combat engineer." "Ah." Dorothy nodded with the understanding of someone who'd seen other veterans struggle with the transition to civilian life. "He's got good hands for the work. Patient, careful." That's not always common in young men these days. By lunchtime, Danny had become the unofficial supervisor for the monument repairs, coordinating efforts and solving problems with the kind of quiet competence that impressed without overwhelming. Jack recognized the transformation. The lost drifter was disappearing, replaced by someone who understood his own value. Mary Ellen had organized a potluck lunch, with long tables set up under the oak trees that shaded the cemetery. Danny found himself in conversations about everything from soil erosion to military service, answering questions with increasing confidence as the afternoon progressed. "You've done this kind of work before?" asked Jim Henderson, a local farmer whose own military service had ended decades earlier. "Different kind of engineering, but the principles are the same. Build something that lasts, use the right materials, respect the foundation." Jack listened to these exchanges with the satisfaction of someone watching a plan come together. Danny wasn't performing for the community. He was simply being himself, allowing his natural competence and consideration to show through honest work. As the afternoon wound down and volunteers began cleaning up their tools, Pastor Williams approached Danny with a thoughtful expression. "We've got more projects like this around the county. Historic preservation work mostly. Not much pay, but steady work for someone with your skills. If you're interested." Danny's motorcycle roared to life on Sunday evening, its engine running smooth and strong after 3 days of careful rebuilding. He sat astride the Harley in the farmhouse driveway, testing the throttle response and listening to the familiar rumble that had carried him across half the country. Jack stood on the front porch with Mary Ellen, watching the younger man run through his pre-departure checklist. Everything about Danny's posture suggested a rider preparing for the road. Saddlebags secured, tool rolls strapped to the frame, gas tank topped off. But something in his expression looked uncertain. "Sounds good," Jack called over the engine noise. Danny nodded and shut off the motorcycle. The sudden silence felt heavy with unspoken questions. "Pastor Williams wasn't kidding about that preservation work," Danny said, pulling off his helmet. "I stopped by his office this morning. There's a whole list of historical sites around the county that need attention. Old churches, family cemeteries, even a covered bridge that's been condemned. Sounds like steady work. Yeah. Problem is, it's here. And I've been running for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stay anywhere. Mary Ellen stepped forward, her expression gentle but direct. Running's easier than staying, but it's not necessarily better. Jack can tell you about that. Danny looked between them, clearly wrestling with competing impulses. I appreciate everything you've done for me, both of you. But I don't want to be another charity case, another lost soul you have to fix. Jack understood the pride behind those words, the fear of being seen as weak or dependent. He'd felt the same way during his early weeks at the farmhouse, when accepting help felt like admitting defeat. You think that's what this is about? Charity, isn't it? Jack walked down the porch steps, approaching the motorcycle with the careful respect due to another man's most prized possession. When I first showed up here, I thought Mary Ellen and this community were helping me out of some misguided sense of Christian duty. Took me months to realize they weren't trying to save me. They were trying to save themselves. Danny's forehead wrinkled in confusion. What do you mean? Small towns die when they stop attracting new people, new energy, new ideas. This place was slowly emptying out. Young people leaving for cities, businesses closing, families moving away. When someone like you or me shows up with skills and willingness to work, we're not a burden. We're exactly what a community needs to survive. Mary Ellen joined them beside the motorcycle. The historical preservation work isn't charity, Danny. It's a real job with real pay, funded by state grants and private donations. Pastor Williams has been trying to find qualified people for 2 years. And the skills you learned in the military, Jack added, they translate directly to this kind of work. Foundation repair, structural engineering, project management. You're not starting over from nothing. You're applying what you already know to problems that matter. Danny ran his hand along the motorcycle's fuel tank, a gesture Jack recognized as the physical equivalent of thinking out loud. What if I'm not ready to settle down? What if I mess it up like everything else? Then you get back on that bike and leave, Jack said simply. Nothing's permanent except the choice to quit trying. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, each man lost in his own thoughts. The evening light slanted across the valley, painting the farmhouse and surrounding fields in shades of gold that made everything look like a postcard from a life worth living. Finally, Danny spoke. If I stayed, where would I live? I can't impose on your hospitality forever, Mary Ellen smiled. There's a small apartment above the hardware store in town. Mrs. Patterson mentioned it's been empty for 6 months. And she's been looking for the right tenant. And if I wanted to keep the bike? There's a garage behind the apartment, Jack said. Mrs. Patterson's late husband used to work on cars there. Still has a lift and all the tools you'd need for maintenance. Danny looked back at the farmhouse, taking in the restored roof, the painted siding, the garden where Mary Ellen grew herbs for the farmer's market. This place really changed your life, didn't it? Changed me anyway. For the better, I think. And you believe it could do the same for me? Jack considered the question seriously before answering. I believe you could do the same for yourself if you had the right place to try. Question is, do you want to find out what happens when you stop running and start building? Danny's hand moved to the motorcycle's ignition key, but he didn't turn it. Instead, he looked toward the town lights beginning to twinkle in the distance, toward a future that might include steady work, community connections, and the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from fixing things that mattered. I guess there's only one way to find out. 3 months later, Jack found Danny elbow-deep in the foundation of the old Calvary Baptist Church, directing a crew of volunteers in the delicate work of underpinning a 130-year-old stone foundation. The church had been abandoned for decades, its congregation long since merged with the Methodist Church in town. But the building itself was a masterpiece of 1890s craftsmanship that deserved preservation. How's it looking down there? Jack called from the scaffolding where he was working on window restoration. Danny emerged from the crawl space, dirt on his clothes and satisfaction on his face. Better than I expected. The original masons knew what they were doing. We just need to shore up the northeast corner, where water damage has been working for 20 years. The preservation project had become Danny's first major assignment, a test of both his technical skills and his ability to manage volunteer labor. Jack watched the younger man coordinate the work with the kind of quiet authority that came from genuine competence rather than borrowed power. Mr. Reeves. Sarah Chen, a graduate student from Vanderbilt who was documenting the restoration for her thesis, approached with a clipboard full of questions. I need to get some measurements of the original stonework before we install the new supports. Danny nodded, already pulling a measuring tape from his tool belt. Let's start with the cornerstones. Those will give us the baseline for everything else. Jack smiled as he watched the interaction. Danny had found his element in this work, combining his engineering background with newfound knowledge of historical construction techniques. More importantly, he'd found his confidence again, the sense of purpose that had been missing since his discharge from the Marines. The apartment above the hardware store had suited Danny perfectly, small but comfortable, with enough space for his motorcycle and tools. It provided the independence he needed while keeping him connected to the community. Mrs. Patterson had proven to be an ideal landlord, offering advice when asked but respecting her tenants' privacy. He's a good worker, she'd told Jack the previous week. Quiet, pays his rent on time, and he fixed my washing machine without being asked. That's the kind of tenant you hope for. Danny had also begun attending Pastor Williams' weekly discussion group, not out of religious conviction, but from intellectual curiosity about the intersection of faith and community service. The conversations challenged him in ways that pure technical work couldn't, forcing him to think about larger questions of meaning and responsibility. The work we're doing here, Danny had said to Jack one evening as they shared coffee on the farmhouse porch, it's not just about preserving buildings. It's about preserving the idea that communities can take care of things that matter, even when there's no immediate profit in it. Jack had recognized the transformation in those words. Danny was no longer just doing a job. He was participating in something larger than himself, contributing to the continuity that made small-town life sustainable across generations. The covered bridge project would be Danny's next challenge. A complex restoration requiring both historical accuracy and modern engineering standards. The state had provided funding through a heritage tourism grant, recognizing that the bridge could become a destination for visitors interested in 19th century craftsmanship. It's going to require some custom metalwork, Danny explained to the County Historical Society board during their monthly meeting. The original iron fittings were hand-forged, and we need to match them exactly. I've been in touch with a blacksmith in Jolton who specializes in period reproduction work. Jack sat in the back of the meeting room, listening to Danny present his restoration plan with the measured confidence of someone who'd found his calling. The board members asked technical questions that Danny answered without hesitation, demonstrating both his understanding of the work and his ability to communicate complex ideas to non-experts. After the meeting, Dorothy Clemens approached Jack with her characteristic directness. Your friend has turned out well. Different from you, but cut from similar cloth. How so? Both of you understand that fixing things requires patience and respect for what came before. That's rarer than it should be in young men these days. Walking back to his truck after the meeting, Jack reflected on the truth of Dorothy's observation. Danny had indeed found his place in the community, but through his own path rather than simply copying Jack's journey. Where Jack had been drawn to domestic restoration and family building, Danny was gravitating toward public works and historical preservation. The diversity of their contributions strengthened the community in ways that went beyond the specific projects they completed. They represented proof that small towns could still attract capable people, that rural life offered opportunities for meaningful work that cities couldn't match. As Jack drove home to Mary Ellen and the farmhouse that had become the center of his world, he thought about the cycles of renewal that kept communities alive. People arrived broken, found purpose in useful work, and eventually became the foundation for the next generation of lost souls seeking redemption through service. The call came on a rainy Tuesday in November, just as Jack was finishing his morning coffee. Tommy's voice on the phone carried the excitement of someone with news too big to hold back. "Jack, Lisa's pregnant. We're going to have a baby." Jack set down his cup carefully, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him like a warm blanket. "That's wonderful news, son. How's Lisa feeling?" "Morning sickness, but the doctor says everything looks good. We're due in late June. Jack, I wanted to ask you something." "What's that?" "We've been talking about names, and if it's a boy, we'd like to call him Robert, after great-grandpa Rob. But we also want to give him a middle name that honors someone who taught me what it means to be a man. Would you be okay with Robert Jackson Mackenzie?" Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion he hadn't expected. In all his years with the Hells Angels, he'd never imagined his name would be passed down through generations. "Connected to family legacy and continuity, I'd be honored." That evening, Jack shared the news with Mary Ellen as they prepared dinner in the kitchen that had witnessed so many family conversations over the decades. She smiled with the particular joy of someone who understood the significance of new life in places that had seen too much loss. "A baby in this house again," she said, stirring soup with the wooden spoon that had belonged to Helen Mackenzie. "It's been too long. Tommy says they want to move back here after graduation. Raise the child where his family has roots." Mary Ellen nodded, already envisioning the changes a young family would bring. This place was meant for children. All those bedrooms upstairs, the big yard, the garden where little hands can learn to grow things. Jack walked to the window overlooking the back pasture, imagining a small child running between the vegetable rows, learning the same lessons about patience and care that had transformed his own life. The continuity felt profound in ways he struggled to articulate. The next morning brought another surprise. Danny appeared at the farmhouse kitchen door, holding a letter and wearing the expression of someone with complicated news. "Remember I told you about my ex-wife Jessica and my kids?" Jack poured coffee for both of them, recognizing the careful way Danny was approaching whatever he needed to say. "She called last night. Her new husband got transferred to Nashville for work. They're moving to Tennessee next month. How do you feel about that?" Danny sat heavily at the kitchen table, unfolding the letter with deliberate care. "Scared, excited, confused. I haven't seen Emma and Jake in almost 2 years. They were 8 and 6 when I left New Mexico. Now Emma's 10 and Jake's 8, and I'm basically a stranger to them. What does Jessica want? She wants to try again. Not with us, but with me being part of their lives. She says the kids ask about me, wonder why their dad doesn't visit or call." Jack understood the complexity of Danny's situation. Military service and divorce had created wounds that couldn't be healed quickly, but proximity offered opportunities that distance made impossible. What would that look like? Jessica suggested I could see them every other weekend, maybe some holidays. She wants to take it slow, make sure I'm stable before we commit to regular visitation. And are you? Stable? Danny considered the question seriously. More than I've been in years. The work with Pastor Williams has been good for me. Having a purpose, being part of something bigger than my own problems. But being a father again, he shook his head. I don't know if I remember how. Nobody remembers how to be a parent, Mary Ellen said, appearing in the kitchen doorway with an armload of laundry. You figure it out as you go, same as everything else worth doing. Jack thought about Tommy, about the gradual way they'd built trust and affection through shared work and consistent presence. Start with what you know. Teach them things. Spend time working on projects together. Kids respond to genuine attention more than grand gestures. Danny folded the letter and slipped it into his shirt pocket. Jessica wants to meet with me next week when they come to look at houses. She says the kids don't have to know yet, not until we figure out if this can work. What do you want it to work toward? I want to be the father I should have been from the beginning. I want them to know they can count on me, that I won't disappear again when things get difficult." Jack recognized the determination in Danny's voice, the same resolve that had carried him through difficult restoration projects. "Then show them. Not with words, but with actions. Be where you say you'll be. Do what you say you'll do. Trust gets built one decision at a time." As Danny left for work at the covered bridge site, Jack reflected on the expanding circle of family and connection that seemed to radiate from the farmhouse. Tommy and Lisa preparing for parenthood, Danny working to reconnect with his children, all of them finding ways to repair relationships that had been damaged by time and circumstance. The pattern felt intentional, as if the house itself attracted people who needed to learn about commitment and continuity, then sent them back into the world with the skills to build lasting relationships. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in late spring, bearing the return address of the Tennessee Department of Transportation. Jack opened it with the same careful attention he'd once given to legal documents from the Hells Angels, though this time without the accompanying dread. Notice of highway project cancellation, he read aloud to Mary Ellen as she worked in the herb garden. Due to environmental concerns and community opposition, the Wilson County Highway Expansion Project has been officially terminated. Mary Ellen straightened from her planting, dirt on her hands and satisfaction on her face. So the farmhouse was never really in danger, not from the highway anyway. Turns out sometimes fighting for something is more important than whether you win or lose. The irony wasn't lost on him. 7 years ago, he'd fought to save a house from demolition, rallying a community around the idea that some things were worth preserving. Now the threat that had originally brought them together had simply evaporated, rendered irrelevant by changing priorities and environmental regulations. But the house had been saved long before the highway project was cancelled. Saved by repair work and community investment, by Tommy's commitment to his family legacy, by Jack's decision to stay and build rather than run and destroy. Robert Jackson Mackenzie had arrived 3 weeks early, a healthy baby with his father's determined chin and his mother's intelligent eyes. Jack had held his namesake for the first time in the same kitchen where he'd once made instant coffee on a camping stove, marveling at the weight of new life in his work-roughened hands. "He's going to grow up here," Tommy had said, looking around the restored farmhouse with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully passed a heritage forward. "5th generation of Mackenzies to call this place home." Jack had nodded, understanding that his own role in the family story was both essential and temporary. He'd been the bridge between loss and renewal, the catalyst that allowed the Mackenzie legacy to continue. But the future belonged to Tommy and Lisa and their son, just as it should. Danny's reconciliation with his children had progressed more smoothly than anyone had dared hope. Emma and Jake visited every other weekend, shy at first, but gradually warming to a father who'd learned patience and consistency through restoration work. Jack often saw them at the covered bridge site, where Danny taught them about engineering principles while they helped with simple tasks. "They're good kids," Danny had told Jack the previous weekend. "Smart, resilient, willing to give their old man a second chance he probably doesn't deserve." "None of us deserve second chances," Jack had replied. "That's what makes them grace." The covered bridge project was nearing completion, its 19th century craftsmanship restored to full glory through Danny's careful attention to historical accuracy and structural integrity. The State Tourism Board had already designated it a heritage site, expecting visitors from across the region to come see an example of American engineering from a simpler time. Jack walked across the bridge on his way home from town, running his hand along the restored railings and appreciating the solid feel of old-growth timber beneath his feet. The bridge would outlast all of them, carrying future generations across the same creek that had challenged travelers for over a century. At 74, Jack found himself thinking more about legacy and less about daily concerns. His body reminded him regularly that he wasn't young, though the work had kept him stronger than many men his age. Mary Ellen, at 68, showed similar signs of time's passage. though her spirit remained as vibrant as when he'd first met her in the general store. They talked about marriage occasionally, but somehow the formal ceremony seemed less important than the daily choice to build a life together. They were partners in the deepest sense, sharing work and dreams and the quiet satisfaction of growing old in a place they'd helped preserve. The farmhouse itself had become something of a local landmark, mentioned in tourism brochures as an example of successful historical preservation. Jack tolerated the occasional visitors with good humor, though he always made it clear that this was a home first and a museum never. On quiet evenings, when the last light faded from the Tennessee hills and the house settled into its familiar creaks and sighs, Jack sometimes sat on the front porch and marveled at the journey that had brought him here. From the Hells Angels to this peaceful valley, from a man who solved problems with violence to someone who built solutions with patience and skill, the transformation felt complete but not finished, if such a thing were possible. There would be other lost souls finding their way to this valley, other broken things requiring attention and care. The work of building community, of preserving what mattered while making room for necessary change, was never truly done. It was enough to know he'd played his part, that the boy whose name he shared would grow up in a house restored by love and stubbornness in equal measure.